For a long time, I have counted myself a feminist, probably since college. Equality of women has always just seemed reasonable. Plenty of my female classmates were smarter than me, and they had all the skills and aptitude for leadership. It's difficult to imagine how we, for millennia, saw women as inherently inferior. I considered myself a feminist because I held the simple belief that women are inherently equal to men and should be treated accordingly. In the past few years, though, I, along with a lot of men, have had to look more deeply at the issue. I had heard stories of surviving sexual violence from a few close friends. In my own denial and swaddled in my own male privilege, I categorize those stories as horrible, isolated events. This year, with the story after story from the Me Too movement, we men have had to grapple with the fact that violence or the threat of violence is an ever-present reality for women. I'm grateful to the brave women who have come out and shared their stories, not just of violence, but stories of being overlooked for promotion and being dismissed as less capable, being bullied, being shamed, being ignored, being groped. I will never know what it's like to live in this world as a woman, but I'm getting a much better picture. So women, thank you for your patience with us. We are learning. Yesterday, several Tapestry members participated in the Women's March in Santa Ana. I was sorry I couldn't make it. I wanted to be there to be with Tapestry members in something that's important, that we care about. But also, I've learned to enjoy the tenor of the Women's March. Being a part of a large-scale march or protest is usually a shared emotional experience. Some marches feel angry, and some are grieving a loss. Some are a huge party like Pride. But the Women's March, from the very beginning, has focused on a positive message. The Women's March and the Me Too movement have done an amazing job of standing up to sexism and misogyny without rejecting men. Mobilizing a large movement without demonizing your adversary takes a whole lot of discipline. Honoring the worth and dignity of every person is an incredibly difficult path to follow, even when you're fighting injustice, strangely enough. Perhaps especially then. That's the call of Dr. Martin Luther King. As we celebrate his legacy, we remember that his invitation to join the movement was not an easy one. Then and now, he called people of goodwill to make sacrifices. Our reading today was from his letter from a Birmingham jail. In that iconic essay, he railed against white moderates, more specifically, moderate religious leaders who cared more for maintaining the status quo than creating justice or sharing love. He said, "For years now I have heard the word wait. It rings in the ear of every Negro with piercing familiarity. The wait almost always means never. We must come to see with one of our distinguished jurists that justice too long delayed is justice denied." In that same letter, King pointed out the difficult truth that we still have trouble with. Oppressors never willingly just give over their power. He wrote, "We know through painful experience that freedom is never voluntarily given by the oppressor. It must be demanded by the oppressed." Writing about Dr. King in 2019 is not an easy task. We have so sanitized his memory with holidays and street names and statues. We forget that his message was really revolutionary. He didn't ask for justice someday. He demanded justice now, in a way that was scary to a lot of America. He was called the most dangerous man in America by the FBI and had a 17,000-page file with the FBI by the time he died. The reading from earlier is from the same piece of writing, this letter from a Birmingham jail. In it, King understood himself to be an extremist for justice and for love, and he invited us to follow him. I don't imagine his call would be all that different today. The challenges have changed some. Racism that used to look like segregation now looks like a war on drugs and police violence and a nonsensical border wall and defunding of public schools. Racism looks different today. It's hidden better, but it's still there. Our extremism for justice is still needed. And today we have a better understanding of the linkage between racism and other types of oppression. We know that helping one of these issues helps us all, and that none of us are fully liberated until all of us are. We have such an aversion still to this idea of being extremists. That sort of labeling is a way that people committed to justice have been dismissed for thousands of years. Not so long ago, feminism was a bad word. It still is in some circles. Giving women the right to vote was extreme. What a scandal. What kind of radical left-wing kook would support that kind of agenda? Only an extremist would suggest that people actually deserve equal rights. Only an extremist would suggest that all people are legally and spiritually entitled to equal opportunities. Until very recently, supporting same-sex marriage was an extreme view. We forget that Obama won the 2008 presidential election supporting civil unions, but publicly opposing same-sex marriage. Most of the ideas that we now take for granted as fair were one day extremist. Thank God someone had the courage to take those positions and stand up for them. Thank God for the extremists who carved out space for us to be here. Being an extremist doesn't call us to violence or to dehumanize others. Quite the opposite. Being an extremist for love is about loving our neighbor, our brother, our sister, enough to say, no, we're not going to do that anymore. Being an extremist for justice means loving our elected officials, our president, enough to tell them no. We're not going to waste $7 billion on a monument to racism in the desert. No, we will not continue to allow the wealthiest Americans to hoard grotesque amounts of wealth while significant numbers of people fight malnourishment and homelessness here. No, friend, neighbor, we're not going to treat women as sex objects instead of the capable, bright, amazing human beings that they are. We're not going to do that anymore. If these are extreme positions, then so be it. I suppose we are extremists for justice too. Being an extremist indicates a certain depth of commitment. It's not a momentary position. Being an extremist for love, the way King thought of it, was a lifelong journey. You've probably heard the statement that the arc of the universe is long, but it bends toward justice. It gets used all over the place now. King used this line, as did Abraham Lincoln, but neither of them originated it. It was actually the Unitarian preacher and activist Theodore Parker who made the statement. The arc of the universe is long, but it bends toward justice. Theodore Parker is known as a brilliant theologian. He was also a brave abolitionist activist. Beyond speaking out against slavery, he sheltered escaped slaves in his home. He notoriously kept a loaded pistol in the drawer of his desk because he felt responsible for defending the people taking shelter in his home. He said in one of his most famous sermons, "The goal of Christianity seems to be to make all men one with God. The particular duties it enjoins are humility, reverence, sobriety, gentleness, charity, forgiveness, fortitude, resignation, and active love." If you can cut through the Christian language, Parker is saying that the most important thing in our religious life is our relationship with one another and with the sacred. We're called to active love because we believe that love can change the world, but it takes a very, very long time. The arc of the universe is long, but it bends toward justice. Theodore Parker died in 1860, about 100 years before King would have said those words. And Theodore Parker was hearkening back to the life and path of Jesus. It's a long, long arc. It's not just that 2018 was a long year or this has been a long, painful presidency. It wasn't even that the civil rights movement was long or any other journey. The quote says the arc of the universe is long. It's a theological claim. Our hope is in a much larger scale than this year or this lifetime. Being an extremist for justice means signing on for a journey even though we may not personally reach the destination. One of the most poignant speeches that Dr. King made, I think, was delivered in 1968, the night before his assassination. It was his mountaintop speech. He said, "Well, I don't know what will happen now." This is the night before his death. "I don't know what will happen now. We've got some difficult days ahead, but it doesn't matter with me now because I've been to the mountaintop and I've looked over and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. So I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything." After multiple attempts at his life, Martin Luther King knew that the path was almost certain to get him killed. He knew that he would not live long enough to see the end of the struggle for justice. And I have a hunch that he knew that we wouldn't see his dream realized in our lives either. In 2019, we are together at a bit of a mountaintop moment. There are wonderful glimpses of promised land. We've seen great steps toward equality. The Me Too movement has lifted women's voices and illuminated a path forward. Lawmakers are finally taking serious approaches to stopping the war on drugs and supporting significant prison reform and sentencing reform. Black Lives Matter was and is a path toward broad-based liberation for Black people, Latinos, LGBT people, and the poor, and young activists confronting the gun lobby give me hope for a future of peace. In his speech in Memphis, Dr. King said, "I am not afraid because I've been to the mountaintop and I've seen the other side." But he is not the only one with a responsibility for vision and dreaming. We are too. My deep hope is that we can take a cue from the Women's March and from Dr. King to be extremists for justice and for love. To engage in that kind of struggle, we have to have vision. So what does the other side look like for you? What are you hoping for? What kind of world are we building for our children and our grandchildren? Knowing what we're for is far more important than knowing what we're against. So let us dream big. Extremist dreams for our community, for our country and our world. Amen.